during a number of the previous recent meetings of the CTPC, we'd been discussing from different speakers, including the Maine International Trade Center, the importance of certain Maine industries or exports to the state's economy, and specifically certain products like Maine lobsters, Maine blueberries, that kind of thing, products that are associated with Maine. And the topic has come up a number of times: what are the tariffs that are involved or not in these different products, and how might Maine's ability to successfully export these products be affected by any of the free trade agreements that are currently being considered. And so during previous meetings, given the interest in those topics, it was asked if I could invite Mr. Jacobson from the perspective of the export of Maine lobsters to come talk about that product and have a discussion really about that and about those topics that I just mentioned. So hopefully that's somewhat helpful. And that's the context in which Mr. Jacobs has been invited to appear before you.
That makes sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great.
So let me talk a little bit about the collaborative. Just a couple minutes ago, I'd really like to get into the Q&A about. So we got started in a response to the price problems with lobster in 2012. The catch came early. Canadians were late. It was too much lobster, not enough processing. Price went down. What do we do? So we were the answer to that question. What do we do? And that was to try a professional, robust, well-funded marketing effort to see if we couldn't brand Maine's lobster and support that demand, not only in bad times, but maybe in good times, and raise it up as well. So that legislation was passed through 2013. The board sat in 2014. And it took a while for the board to figure out what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it. I got hired in August of last year. And in Q4 last year, we hired an agency called Weber Shandwick to help us. Weber Shandwick is the group that does Got Milk, you know, that mustache campaign. The other white meat, they do Ocean Spray cranberries. Really, really good at food marketing. They understand commodity groups such as ours. So our first conversations with them were around what's the strategy. And they have some really smart people. We sat in a room for a couple of months and talked about how we ought to think about Maine lobster and where we could get the most bang for the buck. Parenthetically, when I first got the job, I called around to other marketing boards, frankly, to figure out what the role really was. I called the guy that runs the American Pork Board, and we talked for an hour and a half, and at the end I asked him what his budget was, and he said $97 million. Mine is 1.5 this year. It'll be 2.2 next year and the following 3 years, at which time we come back to the legislature and see if we did good enough to get reauthorized. So California avocados is $15 million. I talked to California almonds. They're $7 million. Alaska just announced today that they're cutting their budget 10%, or $2.2 million. So they're cutting their budget, my whole budget, and it's only 10% of theirs. So to give you an idea, it's a crowded marketplace. Not crying poor mouth, we're making a good effort, but there's a lot of competition out there. So part of our conversation is how do we narrow our focus to make the most use of the money that we have and best use. And so we sort of took a look at where Maine lobster goes as best we could. One of the things that I've been surprised to find out is how little data we have. We have boat price and landings, and that's it. So and the supply chain is horribly complex and opaque. So the processors and dealers, there are 315 of them, and some of them are very big, some of them are very small. They sell locally and they sell internationally, and it's hard to know where all the lobster goes. They also sell to third parties, like PFG and Cisco, big food distributors, who will then take it to a warehouse in New York and sell it to whomever, who sells it to somebody else, who finally gets to a restaurant. So for us to be able to track the price changes along the way and really get an indication of what the value of the catch is, it's very, very difficult. And so we're left with a very imperfect dock price, which only indicates, frankly, the the negotiation between the processors and the harvesters, not very much about the health of the market, at least in a particular time. Over time, it probably does, but over time. So the question then was, where do we focus our efforts and on what product? Because as you know, lobster is a lot of things. It's live lobster, it's frozen lobster, it's meat, it's tails, it's value added, mac and cheese, whatnot. So where should we focus our energy to get the most bang for the buck, and in what markets? So we looked at the data that we do have, and the price at the dock goes down, as not surprisingly, when our supply is highest, which is usually in the summer months when they're catching all the lobster. So July, August, September, if you look at the data, the price curve does this with supply. So we thought if we could focus our efforts on those months where we catch the most and make the lowest price a little higher, why then that would be better across the spectrum. So that was really led us to then look at what are the markets. Total export of Maine lobster, about 10% of the catch goes export. We've heard a lot about China. It's about 2% this year of the catch goes to China. A lot of money. But nevertheless, not a lot of pounds. So the question for us was, do we focus on overseas markets or do we focus on the U.S.? And it became pretty clear that we hadn't been to Pittsburgh and Cleveland yet, and it seemed like Shanghai and Hong Kong were maybe a little further afield until we get to Pittsburgh, was our thought. So our thought was, and then we sort of looked at trends in the marketplace and what are the trends affecting where our lobster gets eaten. About 85% of seafood in the United States gets consumed in a restaurant. We think for lobster it's closer to 90%. Most people don't take it home. We're weird as Mainers. Most people eat it at a restaurant. So the fact that most of it was eaten in a restaurant, 90% of it is eaten in North America, became pretty clear for us that our strategy ought to be around restaurants in the U.S. We focused on chefs and restaurants. One of the things that's happening in the food market right now is this notion around seasonality, and you see it when you go out to eat. What's fresh today? What did they catch? What's grown today? That seasonality matters. What do we catch when our season's big? What we would call soft shell. The first conversation I had with a chef about soft shell, I spent 20 minutes talking about crab. So we put ourselves back in the room and said, you know what, we don't want to talk about soft shell crab, let's rename it new shell. And so the new shell moniker was born because chefs didn't really understand. The second sort of trend that is really important right now for the restaurant goers is this notion of farm to table. Who caught my food and how did they catch it? Was it sustainable? We have a better message on that than anyone in the world. And so that became, where is that message interesting? What's interesting in the U.S.? Not so interesting in China, where they don't care so much about sustainability, at least yet as a market trend. So again, where are we good? We're good on sustainability. We're good on the stories of lobstermen. The U.S. is where those stories are going to really pay off. And then the third trend was really around who are the people that go to restaurants, and we've learned through the data that something like 50% of restaurant visits are people that are 18 to 34. Half of that demographic in the United States is on Instagram. So it became pretty clear for us that to make this work, we not only had to focus on chefs, but we had to focus on social media to get at the folks that are eating the lobster. So that's sort of in a nutshell. That took a year. So I've done it in 4 minutes. But that's how we settled on the strategy in the U.S. I want to tell you an anecdote on just to make it clear to you that we haven't abandoned any exports or supporting the folks that do export, but it's in this way. So I met with the dealers very early on last year, and one of the things they said to me is, we need a day. We need something at the end of September, early October, because summer's over after Labor Day and people forget about lobster. And if we could have a day then before Thanksgiving and Christmas and then New Year's, that would be very helpful. So I contacted Senators King and Collins and asked them if they could get a resolution passed through the United States Senate declaring a National Lobster Day. And I figured a resolution would be easier than a real-life bill because that would have to go to the House and all that. Resolution they can do easily, or relatively easily. And they both agreed and jumped on it and got some co-sponsors, and we got a day, September 25th. And a lot of people weren't as enamored of that as I was. We pitched the story pretty hard. We got over 120 placements that day that reached 153 million Americans. We got 20,000 tweets with the National Lobster Day hashtag that reached 15.3 million Americans. And we also, after they established the day, I emailed back to Kay Rand, who's Senator King's chief of staff, and I asked her if she would ask the president to pardon a lobster. And she wrote me back and said that I was crazy. And I have framed that email because I'm not sure everybody has a chief of staff of the United States senator that's called them crazy in writing, but I do. And it's on my wall. But anyway, she asked. And the White House came back and said, we can't do it. We got the Pope in the morning. We got the president of China for dinner. We're a little busy that day, which really gives you some perspective, right, about how life is. But Kay persisted and said, well, how about you serve lobster to the president of China while he's in town for the state dinner? They said yes. We got all the menu, used Weber Shandwick in China to push that story. It appeared in 67 newspapers in China, and it reached 500 million people. So we're finding places, and we help a lot of the exporters, the exporters, for collateral and advice from Weber and whatever we can do. It's just not our main focus. So with that, that's sort of our story.
Representative Saucier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just curious, did it increase the business of Lobster Day?
Yeah, it's hard to know because the data's so bad, and we've started, we really, after we got done with the strategy and started, we went live June 15th this year. I can tell you that one dealer told me that he also marketed online the Maine Lobster Day. The same week last year, he was up 6 times the week this year. Yeah, we think we're having an effect, and we start measuring that a little more in detail starting next year, and I think you're going to see our report card reflect an increase. It's so hard to know exactly whether the price, or what happened. We only have so much to sell, right? Unlike a manufacturing, we can't build more, so we can build more demand, and so the result of that will be hopefully higher prices across the supply chain. And where we're going to try to measure that is on menu mentions. One thing that we found is there's about just over 2,000 what we call upscale casual restaurants between Baltimore and Maine. And we did a menu survey and found out that 4% had Maine lobster on the menu, and only 17% had any kind of lobster on the menu. So if we can raise those numbers, I think it's a pretty good indicator of demand, and then we'll have to hear from the dealers whether or not they saw price increases. But our working model is that if we get on more menus, the prices will go up across the supply chain.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What's the impact of the Canadian lobsters? When it crosses the border, does it become a Maine lobster?
In a lot of restaurants' minds, it does.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Is it considered a Maine lobster? Because I know that it used to be in the fish business. There used to be a lot of back and forth across the border. I'm talking 40 years ago. So
Nothing changed, sir.
Yeah.
Especially with lobster. Some goodly percentage, half of our processing capacity is in Canada, and so a lot of it goes to Canada and then comes back. The difference between Canadian lobster typically and American lobster is we catch the bulk of 70% of what we catch is new shell. So one of the reasons why we focused on this new shell campaign is that really differentiates us from the Canadian lobster. In the export arena, preparing for this meeting, I asked a few of our exporters sort of what the Canadian impact was for them, and you got to remember we're catching the same species, and 30% of what we catch is hard shell. So that's in direct competition or cooperation, depending on how we play with the Canadians. Where it gets difficult for us is when Canada negotiates a deal that's different than ours from a tariff perspective. So what I heard from the dealers, and if you want to get into more of this, I would humbly suggest that you bring in some of the dealers that are actually doing business overseas to get more of the nitty gritty. But where they find the problem is that Canada will get a lower tariff than we have, And now, my same lobster costs 25% more, or whatever the tariff is, and that's their concern. They're not so much against tariffs, although in the broad sense, low tariffs are better, or no tariffs. But where the real rub is in comparison to the Canadian tariff.
Another question, Mr. Palmer? Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Just following up, is there a different tariff, example, China? Is there a different tariff for Maine lobsters in China as opposed to Canadian lobsters?
There is.
So how do they know whether or not we've got Canadian lobsters shipped into Maine who became legitimized as Maine lobsters? And
That traceability is a difficult question. Another problem, and you might have heard this in your travels, in China, predominantly Maine lobster is branded as Boston lobster. And the reason that is because it goes and clears customs in Boston. Typically, it'll drive to Boston, get on an airplane there, and so it gets to China with Boston on the paperwork, and so they call it Boston lobster. I think that would take a lot of money to change that. But there are, across the border, controls. It's not as easy to just, truck a whole bunch in and then export it to China. But I wouldn't have any information as to whether or not that happens or not. But I'd be surprised if it's a lot.
Sure, go ahead.
what is the difference in tariffs? With the
You
Canadian?
know what? I'm not an expert on that, but I know it's different. I do understand that TPP reduces the tariff on lobster 25% as it stands now.
So that could be good for us, for sure.
It could be good.
I'll ask.
Yeah, that would be, from what
There
I
you go.
understand from a couple of dealers that I asked, that currently about $1.8 billion of overall exports goes to TPP countries out of Maine. And the lobster tariff would go down, 25%. So that's what, no, I think that's overall exports from Maine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Which is 10% of the total.
The real issue, I think, around TPP, or the things that I heard about what scared them is all of our exporters just about are certainly small businesses by federal standards. Most of them are small businesses by Maine standards. And so the dispute resolution and those contract law and all that is really scary for some of these smaller companies. And it is a deterrent for our folks looking at that as a potential market. Contract law, dispute mechanisms, those sorts of things are very difficult if you're a two-man shop in Scarborough. You just you back off. So those are things that folks are concerned about from at least the research I did.
Christy?
I have a question for Mr. Jacobson. Whoops, I'll approach closer here. As a mom with a 7-year-old who has a deep penchant for shrimp, it's really hard for me to buy shrimp because I have to look for the little tiny American shrimp because a lot of the shrimp from Malaysia and so forth are harvested with slave labor, which I hate to feed my 7-year-old. So do you have a worry on the flip side that the TPP will lead to that kind of, maybe not, it won't crowd out market share of lobster because lobster is unique, right?
Well, we keep telling them that. But in the U.S., if you look at who our competition is on the plate, it's every other protein source. And certainly shrimp is an easy substitute. And it's one of the concerns that we have is if we grow demand high enough that it raises the price, do we then drop off the cliff because a lot of chefs substitute with cheap foreign shrimp? That not only is it slave labor, which is abhorrent enough, but the food safety standards are scary.
Yeah.
So just, a tip for somebody in the seafood business, I always ask where it came from. And if it's not American, be careful.
Yeah, there are
Yeah.
more stringent labeling
Yes,
standards.
yeah, but that, in general,
But that's also
yeah.
can be difficult. So
it can be. On the other side for us, shrimp's already really cheap in Asia. So we're really a specialty food that's in a different market. We're trying to position it that way anyway.
Representative Saucier, did you have a question? And then Mr. Palmer has a question
I
again.
did. I was just a little curious about June, July, and August when you're catching the bulk of the lobster. The business doesn't have any system of maybe storing lobster during that peak time, like most.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question.
Yeah.
Is that yours?
Well, sort of. I'm gonna let Matt handle the question, but in my district, there's a couple young men doing some pretty interesting stuff, working on exactly that issue. Yeah.
Yes, and one of the reasons they have to, right? So tails, for example, all those get frozen and get shipped off. So we wanted to focus really on the live market, because if we could, any supply we could take out of that process side would raise price across the supply chain. So while we're really not focused on raising prices, that demand input will certainly make the demand in other places higher too. So yeah, there's a ton of frozen product, frozen meat. A lot of folks just want the meat, so the processors will do that. Shucks has a proprietary process where they freeze it like instantaneously and suck the meat right out. We're seeing frozen whole live lobsters that get shipped. So yeah, there's a variety of ways, and then all the value add, the mac and cheeses, and there's potato stuffed lobsters now. There's all those, and those are all prepared.
But the fresh market is what's being manipulated by demand dealers, whatever, however you want to say it. When you say they freeze the tails, the price in as far as the market is concerned, when you buy that at the retail level, doesn't seem to change much at all. It's always pretty high.
It's gone down lately, and that's one of the trends that we're seeing is we're not seeing surf and turf on menus across the country like we used to. The fastest growing condiments with Maine lobster right now are wasabi and ginger, honey, Asian influences, and what you're seeing is the claw and knuckle meat, the price of those and demand for that way up. As recipes and different things happen with lobster across the country, and tails not as big a demand. It's letting the cat out of the bag here, but we're going to do a campaign here this fall and through the Super Bowl on tailgating. See if we can't get some folks to cook some tails at home. So. But that's it. I haven't told my board that yet, so just keep that between us.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think we'll be okay.
Mr. Palmer, you had a question?
I just want to talk about food quality in other nations. Marianne and I worked in Indonesia in '76 and '77. We were primarily in Jakarta, but we went to Jakarta one weekend and we saw them manufacturing tapioca. And we haven't eaten tapioca since we witnessed that. So it's a very serious issue.
Yes, sir.
And you have to talk to some people that work in foreign countries to see how that stuff is processed.
That's a great point.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, on the street.
Yeah, well, I wanted to follow up on John's excellent points because, on the trade side, it's both offensive interests, which is let's get those tariffs down so we can market to all those people who are getting the Canadian lobster or not buying it.
And Canadians are our friends. It's counter-cyclical.
Yeah.
They catch in the winter. It's all good.
Good, okay.
Yeah.
So you haven't yet formed the blueberry, cross-border.
No, they haven't quite
marketing.
got their act together. We thought it was hard getting this done here with 5,500 lobstermen in one state. They have 5 provinces.
Right.
It's a whole different issue.
So, well, first I'll preface what I'm saying. I'm going to be reporting later on being at meetings in Miami around the transatlantic agreement, and I went to a restaurant one night and they had Maine oysters, Maine peaky toe crab, and of course Maine lobster, on more than one dish.
I hope you
So,
Facebooks and
in
let everybody know
Miami,
you were
and
there.
it was expensive, and it was a chef. It was an expensive restaurant, so that was good. But so on the offensive side, we're trying to market, and there's things that can be in trade agreements that are helpful there. One is obviously tariffs. The other is the branding aspect. And so I was struck by what you're saying in that, where we're going now is source to table or farm to table, and being able to track it and show that it didn't come from, some unsustainable fishery, and that it is a Maine product. And one of the projects I've been working on lately is looking at how both the TPP, based on what's been leaked, and the transatlantic agreement might affect the ability of states to label their products in ways, and because there are other states right now that do just this. For example, Alaska and Washington State have very robust laws around what you can call salmon,
Right.
for example. And there's been issues around that. Other states where they actually do more farming of catfish and things like that, big issues around what you call that, because they're in direct competition with farmed catfish from Vietnam and other places. So that is something that when the text comes out, I mean, there's issues around the WTO standards, which is what has already prevented country of origin labeling in the United States around meat. But that may be something that you and we want to look at, because if it makes it more difficult or impossible to have those kinds of labeling, then that's an issue. And specifically with the Europeans, they're really big on this, what they call geographic indications. And they're going to be pushing for that, and that is going to be a key part of the transatlantic agreement. And I know that in the Canadian agreement that was just negotiated, the Canadians got almost nothing in terms of Canadian geographic indications. Maybe their interests were elsewhere. But it seems to me, and I don't know, what's going to happen on that agreement, but if in fact the Europeans are getting, Parmesan cheese and, all these other things, that Mainers should be thinking about, well, what about Maine lobster? Or blueberries, whatever.
Yeah.
But that is an offensive interest. On the defensive side is, will there be restrictions on our having labels that go into where the source is? Because they've been challenged in the past as being discriminatory against countries that maybe don't have a sustainable fishery.
Right.
And then the other issue does go directly to what Mr. Palmer was saying about the unsanitary practices in some other states. And one of the goals of these two agreements is that if something is approved as sanitary and cleared to sell in a country that you're in the relationship with, a part of 12 countries in the TPP, then it can be sold everywhere in the U.S. Now, this text is not public. We need to look at it and see if it really says that. But that would be a serious concern from both a public health standpoint, but also from the point of view of having Maine seafood with its high sustainability standards and its high health safety standards being undercut by cheap foreign seafood, slave labor, and then not safe to boot. So this is something that maybe when the text comes out, the commission and also yourself and other Maine producers, of sort of specialty stuff could look at and think about whether or not that tips the balance one way or the other around, whether this is a good agreement or not. And I mean, again, we don't know yet without seeing the text.
No, I think that is exactly right. And those are exactly some of the fears that I've got from our dealers and processors.
Okay. Any other?
Could I ask a couple
Sure.
more technical questions? With regard to the Canadian lobster, does the Canadian government subsidize their lobster industry in any significant way? Like we've heard in the paper industry?
Yeah, let me take a step back on sort of the relationship between the Canadian fishery and the American. The way we've done sustainability is around size of the lobster. You throw the little ones back, throw the big ones back, throw the females back. We've proscribed the trap that has vents you can get in and out of, so that we're not lobsters that can get. They're purposely inefficient. I guess is the way we're talking about it. The Canadian model was built around you can fish for this many days, which is a more traditional model around the world. You can fish from January 1 to whatever. So their provinces all have different fishing seasons and are proscribed by their government. Luckily, their fishery grew up offshore. And so they have bigger boats and they fish offshore, and they fish typically in the winter. And we typically fish in the summer, so they're counter-cyclical. So marketing efforts tend to be complementary, right? And only when our cycles get off, a few years ago when ours came early and theirs came late, and then they all, we sort of overlapped there for a few months. That's not good, because you can't build a church for Easter. To get to your specific question around processing capacity, several years ago, the Canadian government did do some things around shoreside infrastructure, which is why a lot of the processing capacity went up there, along the lines of subsidy, loan guarantees, and the power, of course, was significantly less expensive in some of the provinces. That was a federal government program to help the provinces that weren't enjoying some of the largesse of the oil boom out in Alberta. So to try to make that a little even, the Canadian government did some stuff. And that was, we're talking over 10, 15-year time period. So that's why, for some very good economic reasons, processing capacity grew there. Now, after the 2012, capacity in the U.S., specifically in Maine, has grown. You've seen a couple of shops open up, and we have more capacity here. But again, that direct subsidy, not so much, but in terms of programs for shoreside infrastructure, certainly.
And then more of a technical question. When I worked for the legislature, there was the Lobster Promotion Council. Mm-hmm. Did your group replace that?
We did.
And why? I'm just curious.
The Lobster Promotion Council was how do I say this, poorly funded.
Okay.
And they had, I don't know, between $250,000 and $300,000 a year, so they hired 3 people and had an office, and then had meetings about what they couldn't do because they didn't have any more money, which is an oversimplification, but clearly not a robust professional effort.
And could I follow up? How do you get your revenue? How is?
I call DMR. No, you don't want to go that low. No, so it's a
Because there's so much to go around.
Yeah, so it's a fee on lobster licenses. So the harvesters, the dealers, and processors all have fees associated with their licenses.
That goes directly to you.
Goes to DMR, and then we ask DMR, and they meter it out as it comes in.
I see.
But there was, if I can interject, I recall when this was created, there was a lot of conversation around this. There had to be buy-in from the lobstering community. There were public meetings held all around the state. I'm not sure. I don't recall whether it was definitely voted on or not, but there certainly was industry buy-in and willingness on the part of the lobstermen to see that this was needed in order to, be able to make sure that they were getting a better amount of money for their catch, because it kind of created, to my memory, which is not always very reliable, when prices were really, really bottoming out and there was not enough of a market, and we were having trucks of lobster turned around at the border, and it was a mess. And so out of that mess sort of came this realization that there needed to be a concerted effort to market this product that is unique somewhat to the state of Maine.
It's really been, your recollection is perfect. That's exactly what happened. One of the things that we found in the first year, and I'm happy to send you our findings that we presented to our board, but the amount of ignorance in the chef community about Maine lobster is really astonishing. And I think it's given me a little bit of pause as we think about export markets and markets further afield. I'll just tell one anecdote. There's a chef I know in Chicago who has 2 restaurants that you can't get a reservation in. He's Mexican immigrant. Some people don't know Chicago is the biggest concentration of Mexican immigrants in the United States outside of California. He has a Univision show in Chicago, a food program. He's very dynamic. And I was in his restaurant over the summer, and I asked him if he'd use Maine lobster. And he said, well, heck, I got some recipes I could try. Send me some. So we sent him a dozen soft, new shell Maine lobsters, and he called me in a panic and said, they're alive. What do I do? So that's Chicago. And we laugh, but some of the folklore clouds sort of our ability to market. We've got a lot of educating to do among the chef community. And when we think about going to China and having conversations, it's hard enough with a Mexican immigrant who speaks English.
Right.
I can't imagine how I'm going to do that with someone that speaks Mandarin, but we'll figure it out.
Excellent. Very good. Any other questions? Anything else you?
I would just, if you want to get more into the details and the specific tariffs and how they affect, I'd be happy to send a list of the dealer processors who are expert. And the one that certainly comes to mind is a woman called Emily Lane, who who works for Calendar Islands, who's been doing this probably more years than she would like me to recount. But she is the expert on exports of lobster around, especially Asia. She knows it. So I might invite her if you were really interested in sort of the nitty gritty.
Well, another potential guest.
Yes.
All right, and thank you
There's
for
her
your
contact.
time.
Okay, good. Thank
All right.
you.